those that have already heard this, my name's Alistair. I'll be running the this evening's event, we've established that sound is working fine, so we won't go there again. This evening is all about, unsurprisingly, given the slide and the invites, how to put together an effective CV specifically for the contract market. Now, if there's anybody on tonight who's not in the contract space, it doesn't really matter. What I'll be talking about will be still relevant, but tonight is very much positioned towards established contractors. For those that are fresh to contracting or are thinking about it, let me know. Just enter something into the toolbar facility you've got, and at the end of the session I'll show you something more pertinent to people with a very recent permanent career, if that's you. More on that later. Okay, got a lot of stuff to go through tonight. Because of the way the system's set up, you'll see some slides, you'll hear my dulcet tones. If you need to answer any questions, and I'm more than happy to stay on afterwards and answer any relevant questions about CVs, LinkedIn profiles and such like, type them into the GoToWebinar toolbar facility you have, and then at the end of the session I will go through each question in turn. Sometimes there are quite a few, sometimes there's not very many. It's the luck of the draw. But I'm more than willing to stay on and answer any questions. So if there's something I haven't covered or you need a bit more information about, by all means ask the question whenever you like during the session. I will, in the nicest possible way, ignore the question until the end of the session, otherwise I'll get derailed and wander off all over the place, which is never a good thing. Okay, enough about the protocols and what have you. Just a little bit about who on earth we are first before I get into tonight's session. You've been invited via the auspices of TalentSpa, mail shot deliberately targeted at contractors. Unsurprisingly, given our title, our company name, CV and Interview Advisors, we provide individuals with CV and interview guidance and all things related. The reason I mention this is, of course, partly and unashamedly a bit of a plug, but also to give you the confidence that, in the form of me tonight at least, what you'll hear will hopefully have some resonance to the problems of getting a strong contract CV put together, and how in fact that differs from treating it as if it was a permanent CV, which is a mistake a lot of contractors make. My own background, again, to hopefully give you the comfort that I have a reasonable knowledge about the subject rather than just having woken up this morning thinking it would be a good idea to talk to people about this, is that I've employed people in the past, therefore dealt with CVs from that angle. I've worked in recruitment, both within the contract and the permanent spaces, reviewed north of 10,000 CVs of this company now, and written a few as well, both contract and permanent. So what you'll be hearing about this evening is stuff that we put into practice day in, day out for people, real-life people, real-life contractors, and we know it works. That's the important thing. There are going to be a few cliches flying around this evening, bits of jargon. I'm trying to keep it to a minimum, but hot skills is one such piece of jargon. It's really important that if you're going to put together a strong CV, you know what the skills are being sought by the marketplace. As we will see later, a lot of people get this hideously wrong. They focus on the wrong skills, not only the wrong skills, but completely the wrong type of skills. More on that later. We tend to know what those skills are. It helps a lot. And for those established contractors out there, again, hopefully to give you some confidence in our abilities, we've done a lot of work with professional contractor bodies. So we are and remain an affiliate member of PCG, or IPSI as they have become, and we'll do a lot of work with them and similar bodies around the subject of what it takes to get more work through having an effective CV and LinkedIn profile. Okay, enough about us. Just to reinforce this point about what we do actually having some impact out there, I wanted to show you a brief extract from an email that we got from a client earlier this year. Now, this individual was a bit of an extreme case in the nicest possible way, although it wasn't nice for them at that moment in time. They'd been really struggling to get interest in their abilities in the job marketplace. Extreme case because they battled for 3 years to get any interest or attention in their abilities. Sadly, nobody had bothered to sit them down in that time and tell them that the real problem was not them but their CV. And it was. The CV was horrendous, to be brutally honest. The individual, though, wasn't. The individual was credible, good skill set, appropriate skill set, quite pleasant individual as best you could tell, but they'd had real problems getting interest in the marketplace. They attended one of these webinars. We then were able to help them. We unfortunately had to deal with that "your CV is really poor" kind of message to start with. And once we got that message across, we're able to help the individual put together a far more effective, compelling message about their services and abilities. They got that new CV out into the marketplace and literally overnight started getting calls and emails from recruiters interested in their services. Ultimately, they went on to get a new contract, relatively swiftly thereafter. So although that is an extreme case, and I hope there's nobody going through that kind of torment tonight, I suppose the good news is if the CV is the problem, it can be fixed relatively straightforwardly. First question I wanted to address, therefore, is assessing whether your CV as it currently stands may or may not need attention. There's some fairly simple things to take a look out for. If any of these following issues are true of your CV, or you feel they might be true, they're warning signs that you might need to take some action. First thing, if you're going to market with just a list of stuff, by that I mean, this is my name, this is where I live, these are the qualifications, education that I've had, professional development that I've had, these are the jobs / contracts that I've been working on, the employers / clients that I've worked for, the dates, hobbies and interests, and that's all your CV consists of, basic facts. Surprisingly, that is a bit of a warning sign. Why? Because most people think, well, what on earth is a CV if it isn't a list of stuff? Because lists aren't very sexy, they're not very compelling, they don't really create a picture in the mind of the reader of somebody who can solve their problems. It's just a whole heap of facts. And people interpret heaps of facts in completely different ways from one another. And if you remain unconvinced as to that fact, just think of anything that you've bought recently, be that TV, dishwasher, washing machine, car, boat if you're lucky enough, house. You won't have bought any of those things purely as a result of having considered a rather boring list of things. I like to draw the car analogy. Second-hand or new, doesn't matter. You walk into a showroom, salesperson approaches you, it's clear that you're interested in the car, and they say, we've got a brilliant model for you, madam or sir, it's red, 2 meters wide, 5 meters long, 1.5 meters tall. When would you like it delivered? You'd probably struggle to be convinced that you should even take a test drive based on those kind of crude facts, but that's how most people go to marketplace. They present themselves as just a series of things, rather boring attributes, and what you're hoping is that the reader will guess that somehow from all those facts you are the competent individual with the skills that you know you've got, and you're hoping that they come to that same conclusion. And it just doesn't work like that invariably, as we'll see shortly. So that's a warning sign. Second warning sign, if you've created a CV that's basically stayed in its same format since you left school, college or university, barring maybe a couple of changes, and you just added to it over time, particularly as an established contractor, that's a real problem. Now, you'll know this already if you've already accumulated a sort of 4, 5, 6, 7-page monster of a CV, and you're desperately trying to condense it, but at the same time list everything you've done. That's a real challenge. It doesn't go down well in the marketplace. People don't respond very well to that kind of message. So if that's you, we've got some things that we'll deal with that later. If you don't know what the hot skills are in your marketplace, we'll talk about hot skills later, but if you don't know what they are, if you're unsure as to what they are, it's highly unlikely you'll have a great CV because you won't be addressing what those skills are in the marketplace. And that sort of goes hand in hand with understanding who and what your target audience is. Again, a piece of jargon, I'm afraid, not too hard to get your heads around, but target audience is not just people these days, it's machines as well. For a lot of recruiters and some big employers, there's a computer, a piece of scanning technology, something sitting between your application and somebody taking a reasonably educated decision as to your suitability, often driven by the large number of applicants that those people get. they'll stick a piece of technology in the middle to filter out what appear to be time wasters, inappropriate applicants, blah, 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 blah. Now, the trouble is, if your CV is not very good at communicating what you're about, it's dead easy to get rejected by a machine before a human being's got anywhere near your CV. And the other problem with that is, of course, that nobody really knows why you got rejected. They just know you got rejected. Often the assumption will be the computer is programmed with perfect logic, not always the case. So if the computer rejected you, then it's quite logical from a recruiter's point of view or junior HR person's point of view that the computer must be right, and therefore you were rejected on sound principles. As I said, not always true, but by then it's too late. So your target audience consists of sometimes scanning technology, application tracking systems, etc., etc. It ultimately will consist of hopefully some human beings at various levels, though. So never assume that whoever's picking up your CV will actually know what makes a good you in terms of your peer group. They may not. They may just purely be looking for certain characteristics that somebody has told them to look out for. If your CV doesn't address those characteristics, again, it's dead easy to get rejected. Ultimately, it will get to the hiring manager, somebody who ought to have a reasonable idea about what they're looking for, but by then the numbers will have been whittled down dramatically. It's not uncommon these days to have several hundred, sometimes even thousands of applicants for a role, even for specialist roles. Nobody in their right mind is going to spend a lot of time looking at those documents. So the recruiter or the HR person or the hiring manager's objective is to whittle that down to a very small number, tens at the most, sometimes single-digit numbers. So that's a brutal process to go from 1,000 down to, let's say, 10 for argument's sake. Brutal process, not much time spent on any one applicant until you get to that smaller number. So knowing your target audience and what will turn them on, what will excite them, what will compel them to consider you as a valid applicant is critical. So the bottom line, and the most important message of the evening, bar none, is that you need to go to market with a strong business case as to why somebody should be prepared to interview you. Forget about securing the contract at this stage or the opportunity. It's all about justifying to somebody, the target audience in other words, as to why they should be bothered to interview you. And that's what makes a strong CV. So a bad CV is just a list of stuff. Good CV is a strong business case, a justification as to why somebody should be bothering to interview you. Most people's CVs are a million miles away from being a strong business case. They're way too assumptive. Now, the comment at the bottom of this slide is quite important because logically people say, well, if I'm going to spend any time on my CV or even consider engaging the services of a professional to write it for me, I ought to expect a return on that investment either in time, money or both, which is logical and understandable. Now, we know from the kind of people we're working with, I mean, this is hard to measure, I have to say. It's virtually impossible to get an absolute accurate measure on if you had your old CV and if you had a well-written new CV, what would the difference be? Because, of course, short of applying for the same opportunities with the same CV, which is not a clever idea, we'll never really know the whole truth behind this. But on average, if we compare what was going on before and after somebody having spent some time and attention on sorting their CV, on average, we know there ought to be a strong double-digit increase in number of interviews secured. So it's a meaningful increase. It can make a difference. And if you remember that email I showed you, that individual had been struggling for years to get interest in themselves. It was only the message they were communicating that was a problem. It wasn't anything to do with them or their skill set. Once they changed the message to better suit their audience, people were interested in them. They started getting further engagement. So if you do that, we know on average a 30 to 50% increment is there to be had in terms of getting more interviews. For some people it's stratospherically higher than that, for some it's a bit lower, but that's the average. And finally, in terms of assessing whether you've got a good CV or not, there is one test that you can apply very easily. The trouble is, although this is very obvious when you think about it, most people are given all sorts of reasons as to why they didn't get an interview, which they take as being plausible and truthful, and they're not always so. So let's imagine you apply for 10 opportunities. Doesn't matter what they are, as long as, and the caveat here is, you have to be a firmer view, I guess, that you could technically perform the role in question. So as long as you're feeling comfortable, confident, that you could demonstrate the abilities required for the roles you're applying for, that you believe, hand on heart, you could technically do the jobs. You apply for 10 of them. If you get 10 interviews, happy days. Nothing and nobody can do any better than that. Obviously, whatever you're sending by way of your application is doing its job. The CV's message is strong. If you're not getting 10 out of 10, then it depends on the scale as to what you're happy with and what gets you enough opportunities to convert into actual offers of employment, secure contracts, or whatever. So if you're in the sort of the 0 interviews, 1, 2, 3 interviews out of the 10, that's probably not enough to get things moving. It would suggest that there's something going wrong. Now, what you'll hear back from recruiters, very rarely employers, but recruiters, you tend to hear things: you were overqualified, underqualified, inexperienced, too experienced. There were lots of other people for the job. There were better people for the job. All sorts of what seem like plausible reasons as to why you didn't get any further in the process. And yet you're scratching your head thinking, well, you know, I could do this. This ought to be a slam dunk, in other words. But why hasn't it got any further? Well, the real reason is, in 99.9% of the time, is that whoever picked up your CV just didn't like the message. And bearing in mind this process is brutal, to go from total number of applicants to a manageable number of applicants that are long or shortlisted. Remember, that process is brutal. It means you get, on average, mere seconds of attention, if that, because it may be a machine making the decision. That process is a very quick, does this person seem to have, well, first of all, are they a valid applicant? Do they seem to have the appropriate skill set? Is there any evidence to back it up? Now, for some people, it's even less time than that, less time than it took for me to say it. Somebody's just looking at the CV thinking, is it the right look and feel, yay or nay? So the half reality is, if you're not getting many interviews, it's probably because the message you're sending to that audience is not being received very well, and certainly isn't being received in the way you'd like it to be so. So although that's bad news, the good news is that, as with that individual whose email I showed you early on, those kind of things can be fixed. And if you're going to have to fix anything, it's probably the easiest thing to fix from all of the available options. And all it means is creating a CV that has a stronger, more compelling message. So something can be done about those kind of problems. And the two options you have, of course, you either fix it yourself or you get professional help to do it for you. Tonight will help with both of those aims. So, enough about the diagnostic checks. Suffice to say that if you have a problem and if you are sending your CV and you're not getting the responses you think you deserve, without even seeing it, I can virtually guarantee the problem is the CV and how people are responding to the message. Now, whether you choose to believe that or not is your business. I could go blue in the face trying to convince you, but it is the reality, I'm afraid. If you ever get any chance to look over the shoulder of a recruiter or get some insight into how and why they make their decisions, it will reveal that truth pretty quickly, I can assure you. Now, some of the challenges that I'll be dealing with this evening that writing a strong contractor CV will help with, will address these issues on the screen. I won't go through them in turn, we don't have the time, but if any of these are relevant to you in any way, shape or form, then tonight was going to help. And there may be others. If there are any challenges you think you're facing or have proof to show that you're facing, and I've not mentioned them here, by all means ask a question if you'd like to, and I'll do my best to answer it at the end of the session. But contractors often, particularly experienced contractors, will often go to market with a document that's way too long. They know that, but they don't know how to condense it to get the message across. So if that's you, tonight will help. Particularly over recent years, contractors have often had to take sideways or backwards moves, and for good logical reasons, but then they're now finding it hard to escape from that trap, if it is such a thing. So maybe if that's you, if you've taken a backwards move, you're in a role now that isn't representative of what you'd like to do going forwards, but what you were doing 4 or 5 years ago is representative of what you'd like to do going forwards, but you're harshly judged because of your most recent title or role tonight will also help. In a similar vein, if you've had to take a backwards move and by title you're not quite at the level that you'd like to be and you're finding it hard to escape that, tonight will help. As I say, anything else that you feel is a challenge and you think that you benefit from some way of dealing with, then if I don't tackle it, then please ask away and I'll try and deal with it at the end of the session in the Q&A part. So, in terms of dealing with some of these challenges and putting together a strong CV, what I want to highlight this evening, I guess there are two ways of tackling this. I'm really going to focus on one way, which I'll come on to in a minute, but there are two ways typically that will write a strong contractor CV. The first version, which I want to spend very little time on because I really wanted to target professional, experienced contractors, but the first version of CV that we offer people is a traditional chronological style, but with a tweak. Now, I'm conscious at this point life may get a little bit confusing because when you start talking about two of anything, it sort of deviates from a core. But it is important because there are distinct tranches of the contract market where these styles of CV work really well. And so it is important to touch on them. As I say, if you've got any questions, ask away and I'll clarify later. So one format of CV that we offer contractors is, as I say, a more traditional chronological style, but with this tweak I'll mention in a minute. This style of CV, and the reason why I want to spend less time on it, is that it really does suit new entrants to the contract market. So if you've built up a permanent career of whatever length, doesn't matter, and you've recently gone into contracting, i.e. less than 3 years experience of doing contracting work, this kind of style of CV would work well for you. It also works well where you're dealing with recruiters who really just don't understand the contract market and maybe even still call it some kind of glorified temp desk. In fact, some do call it a temp desk and they still think that's how you operate. So if you're conscious that you're dealing with recruiters who really are puzzled as to why you'd have a limited business or work under an umbrella company, and they just don't understand that nature of work, a more traditional approach is required. There are certain sectors where this more traditional approach also works well, irrespective of your length of contract experience. One of them happens to be financial services with the big banks, investment banks, consumer retail banks, and even some consultancies, accountants in other words, I guess. And they, just because of their systems and processes, they tend to like a more traditional chronological style CV. So for those kind of audiences, that's the kind of style you'd probably want to adopt. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on that this evening, but if you feel that that's where you would be most comfortable for any of those reasons, please let me know and I'll show you the style of CV that I refer to later. The tweak to this more traditional style is that we use what we call career highlights to really illuminate some of the proof as to your ability to deliver in a particular area of expertise. Now, these career highlights form part of the next format of CV that I'm going to be talking about, which is more suitable for professional established contractors. So I'll not dwell on that right now. We'll cover that off very shortly. So this second style of CV is more focused towards out-and-out established contractors. We define that as being at least 3 years experience, but ideally probably 5 years plus. And in fact, the more experience you have contracting, the more appropriate this style of CV becomes. The real benefit and the reason why a lot of the challenges that I mentioned earlier on are dealt with by this style of CV is that it allows you to present to your audience the content you'd like them to see, as opposed to being dictated by laying it out in a chronological fashion. So if you're in a role right now which is not indicative of what you'd like to do going forwards, and you're trapped at the moment, or you feel trapped by that frustration and that restriction, this style of CV, as you'll shortly see, allows you to escape that completely, or enough to make a difference, I should say. If you can wear more than one hat, for example, you do project management, change management, transformation management, business analyst work, and you find it hard to put across that you're not a jack of all trades, master of none, this style of CV can allow you to focus at any one time the skills you'd like people to see you have in your toolkit. It uses, as the earlier style of CV I talked about, these career highlights, it uses the same principles, case studies for want of a better word, career highlights, case studies, whatever you want to call them, doesn't really matter, but bits of story about you, the projects you've worked in, things that you've delivered as powerful evidence-based case studies to support why people should be interested in you. And although I hesitate to use these very words, which is why I put them in sort of inverted speech marks, this is a great document to prove to anybody that would be interested in knowing that you are a proper contractor and you have worked in a variety of environments for a variety of sectors. So IR35 friendly in the sense that it demonstrates quite clearly that you are a professional contractor and there can be no confusion as to you working for just one or two clients. So it can be a very useful way to prove to people that you do operate as a contractor. Okay, structurally, the CV needs to adopt some kind of form and function. What you see on screen now is a sort of start point. Many of you will have a CV that has these kind of sections on it, not necessarily in the same order, but this structure is a good start point for an effective CV. And what I want to focus on this evening is, as I highlighted earlier, if the most important thing you take away from this evening is the fact that you build a strong business case as to why people should be prepared to interview you, it makes sense, I guess, that we really should be talking about that business case and how to build it. So the three areas highlighted at the top of this section, this slide in red, are the three things that you really do need to get sorted on a CV to form this business case. And on both styles of CV, this is achieved in a similar way, but with some subtle differences that I'll describe. So I'm going to spend most of the session now talking about those three highlighted areas because, as I say, if you get those right, it's the horsepower, the engine room, if you like, behind getting this business case built and sorted. And is often the motivation, the impetus behind people saying this person should be in the yes or the maybe pile as opposed to being rejected. I will talk about the other sections of the CV because they're important, but the three areas highlighted are critical. So in turn, what I'm going to do is I'll go through each of these sections, discuss how they should be structured, where most people tend to go wrong. So again, you can draw some parallels between what you're currently doing and what we'd recommend be done going forwards. And after I've dealt with the first couple of sections, I'll show you a real-life CV in the style of this sort of case study, contractor-driven CV style, so you get an idea how it all comes together. So the first of these three sections that are really important, that are critical, we tend to call a professional or an executive summary. You might have it currently as just a paragraph or a couple of sentences that talk a bit about you. You might have called it a personal profile, personal statement, profile, whatever. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but the content is absolutely critical. I'll show you where most people go wrong shortly. It will become apparent where you might be going wrong, if it is you, as soon as I describe some of these compartments. But it makes sense, I guess, if you're going to be talking about what you're capable of and make it relevant to your audience, that pretty much the first thing other than your name on the CV ought to be some kind of reflection of what on earth you are. I'll show you an example shortly, but crudely, if, for example, you were applying for project management roles, irrespective of whether you're actually called a project manager or not, but if that's your stock in trade and you're applying for roles where project management is the key driver, it would make sense to state that you are a project manager, is our view. You might enhance that slightly, as we'll shortly see, but the sentiment ought to be, look at me, I'm a project manager. Why? Because you'll be up against people who, yes, are project managers, and some might be stating that, but you'll also be up against a lot of people who are in no way qualified to perform a project management role in a million years. But they create noise in the system. And if you're not making it clear that you're a valid applicant to your audience, there's a real danger, ironically, that you get rejected because you appear to be like everybody else. And folk at the early, brutal stages of selection will not be reading your whole CV. They'll be scanning it for clues. And we know there are a lot of good people, a lot of good, technically strong candidates get rejected simply because they open up with a very weak personal statement, professional summary, whatever. So what you are is really important. Second thing is, another bit of jargon I'm afraid, you need to explain what on earth your value proposition is. Excuse me. What is a value proposition, you might say? Well, it's your, I suppose, the return on investment you have to offer. If somebody's going to sink 250, 350, 450, 550, 750 a day in you, or whatever, it would seem to be a pretty good idea to give the audience a flavour of where the real return on their investment might lie in engaging your services. Now, people tend not to do that, but it's really important. It's a great differentiator. It automatically makes you look more serious than most other applicants. I will show you an example, as I say, shortly. Linked to that, most people tend to be good at a number of things. Only has to be 3, 4 or 5 things tops, but things that are relevant to the audience that you have to offer, reiterate them, reflect them back to that very audience. And then finally, package it all so that you're addressing the skills being sought by the marketplace. So it seems reasonably straightforward. Most people, as I say, get this hideously wrong. Here's an example which you can maybe use to then assess where you are on a sort of scale. Now, I'd stress at this stage, ignore the fact that this person is a senior finance person. This is an example. Yeah, I can't pick more than one example, otherwise the session would go on ad infinitum. So I have to pick an example. It just happens to be a senior finance person. But I guarantee it doesn't matter what level you're at, how much experience you have or don't have, whatever sector you're in, everybody, anywhere, can write something that addresses the 4 points that I've just been through. Even if, there shouldn't be any on this evening, I guess, technically, but even if you're a recent graduate and you've not actually performed a job yet in your life, you could still write something that adhered to these 4 pillars. So I won't read through this, you can look at it yourselves, but the opening sentence is the what are you? They are an experienced finance director. Their value proposition is the fact that they can protect cash flow and profitability and embed robust financial governance. The things they're good at are listed, prefaced by key strengths include, and we have to assume that they're aligning this with the hot skills in the marketplace because we don't know the individual, we don't know the jobs they're applying for, but it would seem appropriate. Now, in comparing this with what you might have on your CV, and indeed most CVs that I see on a daily basis, what people tend to do is they don't explain what they are. They assume that the reader of the CV will go down to their current or most recent role and figure that out for themselves. Dangerous assumption. Their eyes may never get that far. However high up your CV, your career history is, the reader still may not get there. Remember, the process to whittle down applicants in their total number to a manageable number is brutal, and sometimes mere seconds, or fractions of seconds even sometimes, are taken to make this initial decision. So the most important thing you have to do as an individual is establish that you're a valid applicant with appropriate skills and hinting at some kind of evidence to back that lot up very quickly. This kind of statement, now, it does vary for everybody. Of course, they are bespoke by their very nature, but this kind of statement tends to get people's attention because you'll be surprised, given that most people don't specify this more closely enough, they're not as focused as they need to be, most people appear to be very similar. So if you've got any reference to the fact that you're enthusiastic, positive, driven, entrepreneurial, the ability to work in a team or as an individual, the fact that you've got impeccable interpersonal skills, you pay attention to detail to things, that you can deliver on things that you don't actually specify, all of those what sound like wonderful flowery things that most people have on their CV at this point in time, They are wholly inappropriate. All they do is make you look like most other applicants, and that is what most applicants tend to do. So there is no place for all those behavioural skills. So remember I said earlier, people tend to focus on the wrong skills. And it's not just the wrong technical skills, it's the wrong skills full stop. They talk about things that you can't possibly prove on a CV. So if you can prove that you're more enthusiastic than your competitors on a CV, well, good luck to you. If you can prove that you can work in a team or as an individual to a better degree than your competitors on your CV, again, good luck to you. I've never seen it done well. In fact, I've never seen it done full stop. It's very hard, if not impossible, to prove those behavioural skills on a CV. Worse still, your audience isn't expecting to see any reference to them. Now, at this point, often I imagine people shouting at the screen saying, well, you're wrong, Alistair, because you've gone on about hot skills and the market seeking hot skills, and I've seen from the job advertisements, the postings, the announcements that these clients are looking for people with enthusiasm, entrepreneurialism, the ability to work in a team as an individual. So explain that one. Well, it's quite easy to explain. They are looking for those skills, of course. Even in contractors, often some of these softer skills are important and they're sought. But they're not being judged from the CV. They are important as part of the selection process, but most employers, clients, recruiters will be looking to assess those skills at a far later stage in the process. So it doesn't matter how much you talk about them on your CV, nobody's going to really pay any attention to them. They're not differentiating enough. They'll not get you an interview over and above the people that have taken the time to address these issues that I've just been through. Are you a valid applicant? Do you have the appropriate skills? Is there some evidence, or is there some seed of evidence to show that you could actually deliver the things that I'm looking for as a client? Get that bit right and you're automatically in the upper quartile or even beyond of most applicants. It's that important. Okay, so that's the opening bit, one out of the 3 issues. I'll go through the second one before we take a look at a CV in its full glory, as it were. So this second area is very important because it addresses those technical and functional skills that should be on the CV, not the behavioural ones that shouldn't be anywhere on the CV. Before I show you how this is done, the comment at the bottom of this slide is actually really important, and that is that the vast majority, whatever the number is at this moment in time, the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers can only make their decisions on who to shortlist based on what you've sent them in your CV. And to an increasing degree, I suppose, what they might see on LinkedIn as well. But the CV is still a critical part of the process and the real driver. Now, again, it may seem like an obvious statement, but if it's obvious, why do so many people miss off the critical stuff on their CV? Why do their CVs not present a compelling business case as to why somebody should interview them? Why instead do they go to market with just a list of random things that they think are relevant but actually aren't? And recruiters often get a hard press because they make what appear to be crazy decisions or not the right decision. But sometimes, their job is not to provide CV advice and guidance. Their job is mostly to take a large number of applicants, I suppose you could argue to generate interest in the advertisement, the opportunity in the first place, to then manage whatever number of applicants there are to a manageable amount and present the ones that seem to be best suited for the role to the client. That's their job. Their measurement criteria is pretty much place as many people as you can as quickly as possible to earn a fee. That's what they're measured on. The client's measurement criteria are all about filling the opportunities as effectively and as efficiently as possible. They're not giving CV advice either. They'll all pass judgment on your CV, absolutely guaranteed. You'll probably never get to hear the half of it, but they will pass judgment on it. But their job in neither case is to give you good, sound CV advice. Their job is to find people for the opportunities and to fill those opportunities as effectively as possible. So the only way they can make the decisions on who to interview and then ultimately who to appoint start with the message you've sent on your CV. So if you've sent an inappropriate message, it's not their problem. It's not that they've made a bad decision necessarily. They've made the decision based on the evidence available to them. So the importance of the message you're sending them is absolutely critical. And unsurprisingly, the people who tend to get the most interviews for the so-called best opportunities are the ones with what appears to be a strong CV. Doesn't necessarily make them the best candidate. That is unfair, but if the only evidence you've got at your disposal is that candidate A would appear to be better than candidate B because of what they've sent by the only means that will influence matters, unsurprisingly, candidate A is the one that's going to get the interview. They may not be technically the most competent individual, but at that moment in time, the evidence pointed towards them being the most competent individual, and that's one of life's potential injustices, but you can't argue with the process. So this second area on the CV is really important because it addresses two key things. First of all, it allows you to present to your audience a menu of the technical and functional skills that you possess. And the second benefit is that if you do that right, you populate the CV with keywords and phrases that were being sought by recruiters and employers or clients in the first place. And therefore, you get a double whammy. You get whoever picks up the document looking for evidence a nice reassuring glow as they realize that you would appear to have the skills they're actually looking for. And if they've stuffed you into some kind of database or are searching for talent, you'll appear higher up more frequently or both in the running order because you've got a CV populated with the things they're actually searching for. Another reason why things like enthusiasm, dedication, passion, commitment ought not to be on the CV, because no recruiter in their right mind and no client in their right mind is sat down at their terminal searching for the words enthusiasm, dedication, ability to work in a team or as an individual, entrepreneurialism. They just don't do it. What they'll be looking for are the technical and functional skills that are black and white. You either have them or you don't have them. That's what they'll be searching for. You need to make sure your CV is populated with phrases. These are just examples again, but 2, 3, 4 word statements a bit like this that people actually search for. Now, for each industry, for each sector, for each job function, these skills differ. This is why it's so important to know what skills are actually being sought, because it's the type of things that recruiters and clients will be entering into databases to find out whether people exist with those skill sets. And I reiterate, because so many people do get this wrong, it is nothing to do with behavioral skills. Nobody in their right mind will be searching for folk that have attention to detail as the key discerning factor as to whether they're a good individual or not. Okay, let me show you an example of a CV so we can keep track on how this all sort of hangs together. So what's appearing on screen gradually now is it's a real life CV. It's actually of my boss, Matt, who runs the business. So it's real life data. It's the two sections we've just talked about. Strong opening summary and key skills, or in Matt's case, areas of expertise, as he's described it, that he possesses that the audience in theory ought to be interested in. Again, you can read this for yourselves. I'm not going to go through it verbatim. But the interesting things here, again, ask yourself these questions. I've worked with Matt now for a number of years. I'm sort of his right-hand man of sorts, yet I could not copy and paste his exact summary, stick it on my CV and get away with it. I could take bits from it, in fairness, but only bits. Yet, interestingly, I'd say 3/4 of the CVs that I see on a daily basis, I could take the opening text. In some cases, I could take the entire text, stick it under my name and still get away with it. Probably wouldn't choose to use the same words, but as a statement, I could easily justify everything that 75% of the CVs that I see are saying about the individual. And in the balance of the cases, great chunks of the text I could use on my CV and get away with. And that ought not to be right. All that's saying is that the vast majority of people are appearing to be very similar to one another, even for radically disparate jobs. That can't be right. That's why so many people get rejected out of hand and very quickly, because they just appear to be a Me Too product. So it's really important that this opening summary is a very specific, focused, bespoke piece of text that would be very hard for your peer group, let alone your neighbour, uncle, aunt, friend, mother, father, wife, son, daughter, husband could copy and paste. Just try that, in fact. Literally, take whatever's on the top of your CV, and if you can, pass it to somebody else and see whether they could claim any of it. It happens a surprisingly large amount of time. Okay, and these bullet-pointed bits of sort of key skills, Matt's probably got as many as you'd want on a CV, 14, 7 down the left, 7 down the right. You wouldn't really want to have too many more than that, irrespective of your inventory of skills, and you wouldn't want less than 10, 5 down each side, otherwise it just looks a little bit weak. All of the skills that he's listing can be customized, reordered. They can all be proven later on the CV if he decided to do so. Another distinction, so you can't prove enthusiasm, so there's no point in having it on the CV. So it's a good test. Whatever you put, could you prove it by way of example later on in the CV if you chose to do so? They also, in an ideal world, would be bits of text, comments, phrases, keywords that the audience, of course, is sort of pre-programmed to look for. So if you've done this job really well, you'll be reflecting what your audience is expecting to see for their ideal candidate. Now, this is a bit harder to achieve because you can look for clues in the job advertisements, websites sometimes, postings, but if it's done well with some insight, getting this bit right is a real hallelujah moment, because you would appear to be a very strong candidate just because you've managed to hit a few of the requirements of your audience. And by now already there's a lot of evidence to suggest that strong candidates will be judged as such purely by what people see in this section you can see on screen now. Not always the case, but in a lot of cases this is enough to get into the maybe pile, or the long list, or sometimes even the short list, depending on how the process is working. Okay, let's just go back to the third and final area of this building the business case. Now, before we get into the, you might remember the third key bit is the sort of career highlights or case studies, evidence of your ability to deliver. Now, for a contractor, one of the things that we do before we get into that is just describe briefly that you are, in fact, a contractor. And this is where the CV deviates. So those two formats that I explained, the sort of traditional chronological style and the case study-driven contractor-style CV, bearing in mind that I'm right now focusing on the contractor style, this is the point at which the two styles differ or start to differ. So imagining that you are a professional contractor and you've got some experience as such under your belt, we recommend setting that out on paper, explaining to your audience that you are indeed a professional contractor. Now, the way we do that, again, the text varies by individual, but the sentiment here is, having described in the opening summary what you are, what your value proposition is, the things that you're good at, aligning that with the hot skills, then bullet point key skills, the technical functional skills that you can deliver on. This next bit, headed current role, is an area where the sentiment ought to be something like this. Since whenever, if that's appropriate to mention, in effect, I have been and am operating as a professional contractor or freelancer or interim manager, whatever you want to call yourselves. And I have completed assignments or projects for, and it could be, companies such as, and if it's appropriate to list a handful of companies, that might be a good way of setting your stall out. You might say that you've worked in particular sectors, like oil and gas, or engineering, or whatever, if that was the most appropriate message. You may want to talk about technologies that you'd got experience of delivering, be that hardware or software related. Whatever seems to be the best way of setting out your broad, generic set of skills, your stall, if you like. And then what we're going on to say is, what follows on the CV is a list of things that I would like you to see, Mr. or Mrs. Reader of my CV, in the order that I have chosen, i.e. order of relevance, nothing to do with chronological order of relevance. And what I'm showing you is not necessarily everything that I've done in the world, but it's certainly the most relevant stuff. That's the sentiment. So it's just an introductory statement saying I'm a contractor, I've got experience or expertise in this field or fields, and what I'm about to show you is stuff that I think you'll find most relevant, escaping any chronological trap. Then we follow that with a series of case studies that demonstrate your ability as a contractor in whatever field you've chosen to present. Now, we'd recommend probably somewhere between 6 and 8 of these case studies, which I'll show you how they're constructed shortly, but 6 to 8 of these on a CV ought to be enough to give variety without the CV rambling on to multiple pages, or an embarrassing amount of multiple pages anyway. The key thing here is you pick the most relevant examples you possibly can for your audience. So remember, we're escaping chronological order. Chronological order has no bearing. In fact, time has no bearing on these case studies in any way, shape or form. So you pick the examples that are most relevant to your audience's requirement, no matter whether they were 5 minutes ago, 5 years ago, 15 years ago. It doesn't matter as long as they're still relevant examples of your ability to deliver in a chosen field. 6 to 8 examples. The beauty here is because we're not talking about chronological order, you can pick projects as separate entities. So it could be that you worked somewhere for, let's say, 18 months, and in that 18 months you did 3 really strong things that are super relevant to your audience. You talk about each of those 3 things. You don't try and package it up in the 18 months. You don't try and describe everything that happened in that 18 months in one go. You strip out each of those 3 really important projects and describe them separately and individually and present them to your audience as such. So this is where, remember those challenges I discussed, this is where you can escape chronological traps. You can present your audience with areas of specialism, irrespective whether you could wear 2, 3, 4 different hats, so to speak. You present to your audience what you'd like them to see. And it's got nothing to do with the periods of employment. How we deal with the chronological order, because people like to see a timeline, of course, I'll come on to shortly. But for now, all we're doing is presenting your audience with really good examples of what you could do for them in an ideal world. Now, we use a methodology called STAR, Situation, Task, Action, Results. Lots of people use this kind of a thing in all sorts of walks of life. We use it to construct these case studies to make nice, compelling stories of your ability to deliver. I'll show you an example. This is a real example. It's off Matt's CV. ERAC stands for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, just so you know. For want of a better title, Matt's given it a sort of title of business transformation, and he's describing a time which, for a period of 6 months, he performed an interim ops manager role. Now, the situation here is the first sentence of that text. It's the introductory scene setter, if you like. So you can see that Enterprise Rent-A-Car basically acquired a business that needed sorting out. The task is the responsibility resting on Matt's shoulder at that moment in time. So he was interim ops manager. The actions are the bulk of the remaining text, a series of things that Matt did to effect change or to progress the matter, and the result is the final sentence. And you can see that Matt succeeded in turning the business around within the tight timescale. Now, we'd repeat this, as I say, 6 to 8 times to demonstrate to your audience capabilities and abilities that you had to deliver in areas that they ought to find compelling and relevant. It's enough information for people to think, okay, I can understand what's gone on here, but not so much that you'd bore them rigid. Each of the case studies can be picked from any period of time that you believe to be relevant. You'll notice here there is no reference to the timeline. We have no idea when Matt worked at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. We know that he worked there for 6 months, but we don't know at what point in his career. And that is not relevant at this moment in time. That is not the relevance. We don't need to be talking about that. All this is designed to do is to prove that Matt can act as a transformer of business. In fact, for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll have noticed that business transformation was one of the key areas of expertise that he had bullet pointed on his CV. This is a great example of proof behind that. When it was in his career, I know, but you don't need to know right now, and nor would the audience. It's just not relevant. Let me show you how that appears on page. If I just put Matt's CV back up on the screen and reduce the magnification a bit, you can now see, or gradually, you can now see all of page 1 of Matt's CV in this case study driven style. So strong opening statement, bullet pointed key skills. You notice right hand side of the bullet points, second one down, business transformation. Relevant to that enterprise rent-a-car example I just gave you. Then a little bit of text saying, look at me, I am a professional contractor, have been since 2006. And what follows is stuff that you ought to be interested in, Mr. or Mrs. Reader of my CV, and then 3 case studies down the bottom half of page 1. They're random ones because Matt is not a contractor, but if he was, he'd follow this kind of form. So 3 at the base of page 1, all written using the STAR methodology. Interesting aside, each of those 3 case studies, as indeed the subsequent ones you'll see shortly on page 2 of his CV, equally structured, very similar length and density of text, deliberately so. You'd be surprised how many people write lots about their first achievement, not so much about their second, even less about their third, and guaranteed on paper it just looks like you couldn't be bothered with the third one. You won't intend it to look like that, but most readers, if asked, or what's going on through their mind, and just give me your gut feeling about this individual and what they've been up to, surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, when you see that kind of imbalance, i.e. number 1 project, they obviously like that, it was interesting, relevant and appropriate, they've talked a lot about it. Number 2 reference, slightly less information. Number 3, they probably gave up at this moment in time, or it wasn't that big a deal. And it just looks that way, and that's how it comes across to your audience. So each of our case studies is deliberately written to the same structure and to the same amount of density, same amount of content as each other. So you can't immediately make decisions about relevance and importance other than the order in which they appear. So ideally, of course, the most relevant example ought to be number 1, number 2, number 3, etc., etc. If we flick to page 2 of Matt's CV, I said between 6 and 8 case studies is the magic number. Matt's got 7 by way of demonstration. So you've got the 4 remaining case studies at the top of page 2. And again, they follow the same STAR methodology, same density of text. And you'll notice the one at top of page 2 is the enterprise rent-a-car example, proving Matt's ability to conduct business transformation. Okay. Moment of reflection, as I've called it. Well, very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this as we're tight on time now. You'll have learned enough now to figure out, at least to some degree, whether you think you've got a strong CV or not. And if not, whether it's actually strong enough or not, at least the measures to assess whether it actually performs in the marketplace. So the key things are, you need to go to market with a business case, a justification as to why people should interview you. And if you believe, and you strongly believe, that you deserve to get interviews and you're not getting them, I can virtually guarantee, I can't always guarantee, but I can virtually guarantee that the CV is the root cause of the problem. If you think about it logically, most people don't know you from Adam. So if the recruiter or client knows you already and they're rejecting your approaches, then that's something deeper and probably and arguably a worse problem. Because of course, if people know you and they're refusing to engage with you, it implies that they don't like what they know about. Whereas with most people's problems is what people dislike is the message that they've received, nothing to do with the individual behind it. So that bit can be fixed. And it's all about presenting strong evidence to your audience as to why they should be interested in you. Not smoke and mirrors, not making you bigger and better than you actually are, not trying to paint a picture that isn't true, but just good, valid, substantial evidence of your real abilities in the marketplace. So the only people who shouldn't be doing anything at this stage are those people who are quite happy with the level of interviews and engagement that they're getting, and if that's you, then as I said earlier, happy days, long may it continue. For everyone else, you either fix stuff yourself or you get professional help. And I promise to address both cases. To some degree, the DIY bit's been achieved because I'm leading you down a path to make some improvements. On the professional help, having endured this session, if you stick around to the end, which is not far off now, we do offer some big discounts on our services for people who've been through this. Just to cover off, because it deals with a lot of questions that tend to get asked about the process. If you've never even thought about getting your CV rewritten before and it's a whole new concept, well, at this moment in time you have to take my word that A, of course it works, and B, it's not such a crazy idea. The reality is that we don't amend or tweak people's CVs. It's almost technically impossible. You've either got a document that works or doesn't, end of. If it doesn't, it needs to be fixed, and it's a root and branch overhaul. And that's exactly what we do. The way we do it is that we match you up with a writer who is well-seasoned, mature, probably done the kind of things that you've done, certainly written CVs in your field over a good few years, and knows the technologies, the key skills, the words, the phrases. They won't outpoint you on your day job, otherwise they'd be doing it, but they'll know enough about it to make a difference. They work with you over the phone or Skype and extract from you in the nicest possible way the raw data we need to write your CV and later on LinkedIn profile, which we're briefly going to talk about shortly, I should say. If you don't know what your value proposition and how to present that is, we'll help you with that. That's a key strength in terms of being able to assess what people have got to offer and how to articulate that. That's a large part of what we get paid to do. And we'll also help you, of course, build up these case studies so that if you're trying to appeal to a particular audience, we know what will excite them and compel them to be more interested in you. We can then help pinpoint what we should be hearing from you in terms of evidence. And if we don't think what we're being told is strong enough, we'll tell you and we'll readdress the situation. Bottom line is you leave the building with a far more effective business case, why people should be interested in you. And we know from the people who've been through this process before is that that's the bit that will get you more interest. It will materially help get more interviews, full stop, but it can also help get interviews to better jobs, whatever the better may mean for you. So that could be more senior, it could be better paid, it could be both. But as long as we know what we're trying to do in the first place, we can help engineer the means that will make that a little bit more achievable. So the bottom line is you can then do the maths. You can work out whether that's worth investing in or not. Okay, come back to that in terms of the deals later, but finally, to wrap up on some of the other areas of the CV that I promised to touch on, and then finally LinkedIn. Again, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed when we were on page 2 of Matt's CV, there was a section for his chronological career to date, and that is important. Now, ignore the left-hand side of this slide for now because that refers to the more traditional format CV, which I've not touched on. Happy to show you later. If there's anybody that wants to see that, let me know by the toolbar that you've got, and I'll show it to you later. But on the right-hand side, the case study-driven CV that I focused on this evening, all we reduce the chronological timeline to is a line for every reference, for every entity. So the focus is very much on, I'm a professional contractor. These case studies demonstrate my ability to deliver in the areas that you ought to find compelling, Mr. or Mrs. Reader of my CV. And by the way, this is the timeline behind all of that. Rather than what most people go to market with is, here is the timeline, which actually isn't really presenting me to best effect. But I feel obliged to have to present it in chronological order because that's what I've always done, that's what I see most people going to market with. I know no other way. And there may be a better way, and it may be this case study-driven approach. So as far as the chronological bit's concerned, all we do is reduce to one line the from and to date, the client that you were working with, the title you held. whether it was contract or permanent if you've got a mix, and whether within the contracts you had any extensions or renewals, because that's quite a sellable item, a piece of information. When we go back to Matt's CV, I'll show you how that's done, but literally it's just a line for everything. So you're dramatically reducing the amount of space devoted to the chronological order bit, because for a lot of the audiences it's the least important piece of information. They like to see it, they want to know that you've been in gainful employ, but the real driver is proof of your ability to do the stuff that they're actually recruiting for. And that's where the case studies kick in and work their magic. Very briefly, other areas of the CV that are worth talking about, and I will go through these rapidly. You'll have noticed education, qualifications, professional development hasn't appeared on Matt's CV yet that I focused on, deliberately so. For most people, it isn't differentiating. It's not stuff you need to open up your CV with. It's not stuff you really ought to have even on page 1, interestingly. Headline news you can communicate in a different way. So remember that experienced finance director that I showed you earlier, the professional summary of the experienced finance director. If he had been MBA qualified, then, and sorry, it was a he, by the way. I'm not being sexist there. It was a he in real life. But if they had been, to keep a balance, if they'd been MBA educated, then you could say MBA educated experienced finance director, or an experienced MBA educated finance director, or an ACCA or FCCA qualified finance director. If it was a project manager, you could say that they were Prince 2 qualified project manager. So the headline news you can get across in different ways about your academic abilities or professional abilities. But the detail, schools, universities, results, back of the CV. Ditto personal details. For a lot of contractors, where you live is the least differentiating piece of information. In fact, for some, it can be even harmful. You apply for an opportunity, if it's immediately obvious to the reader that you're in a strange part of the world, which they don't relate to being that where their ideal candidate would reside, some people get rejected purely on that. Literally a postcode lottery. Why give people information that works against you so soon? It may still have a problem with where you live, but if you delay that point and focus all your energy on what you've got to offer, sometimes that can win the day. Technical skills, for those people, particularly in IT, if you've got particular software, hardware, coding skills or sort, sometimes that's worth having on page 1 with the bulleted key technical and functional skills. Sometimes it's okay to leave it a bit later on the CV, but of course that is important, and we would find a space for those skills depending on your background. Testimonial evidence, if you have it, particularly as a contractor, hugely valuable. So even if it's copy and pasting from LinkedIn recommendations, that's not a bad thing, as long as they're recommendations from people that have hired you or engaged you or managed you in the past. So that information can be very useful. Hobbies and interests should only appear on your CV if they materially help your business case. If they don't, which most people don't put them on, is our general advice. And finally, on the number of pages, there is no real rule on this, despite all the urban myths that swirl around. For a professional, established contractor, it's going to be very hard to put together a strong business case in less than 3 pages. Something would have to give. And that something is not normally worth giving on. So 3 or 4 pages is perfectly acceptable. Whether people read it all or not doesn't matter. It's what they read that's critical. And as I've hopefully demonstrated, the what they read might be the little bits on page 1, and that's enough to do the job. It might be bits all over the place, and that's enough to do the job. You and I will never know all the time what people are absorbing and using as a means to make their decision. All we do know is that invariably they've made their decision on something that's quite pertinent and material and evident, and that's normally because the person's message is either very strong and compelling or completely the opposite and dead easy to reject. So our view is just make sure whatever you've got is compelling and relevant. Whether it occupies 3 or 4 pages, 1 or 2 pages, doesn't really matter. But for a proper professional established contractor, be very hard-pressed to get it in less than 3 pages, particularly if you've got testimonial evidence. Finally, LinkedIn. I'll skim through this. It is important, but a lot of it follows the thread that I've talked about already this evening. First comment at the bottom of this slide, the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers use the CV to make a short or long list decision. Of that, the vast majority will then go on to take a look at your LinkedIn profile if you have one. It's probably, as far as contractors is concerned, it's probably verging on the imperative that you have a LinkedIn profile for visibility. Doesn't mean to say you have to have one. If you have some kind of very strong view against LinkedIn, that's your business, not ours. We're not here to say you must be on LinkedIn, but we'd struggle now to see a justification other than a personal decision as to why you'd not want to be on LinkedIn from a visibility point of view, professional visibility point of view. Having said that, most people then go on to dump their CV into LinkedIn and call it job done. Now, of course, if you've got an ineffective message on your CV, hopefully you'll be clearer on whether you believe you have or not now. It doesn't make a lot of sense to replicate that to the masses by sticking it into LinkedIn unchanged. Just as with the CV, there are actually 3 critical areas in LinkedIn that you need to get sorted to help build the business case. They're subtly different areas, but they're important nonetheless. First one is the professional headline. It's the bit of text that appears under your name on LinkedIn. It ought not to be the default setting, which is last or most recent or current job title plus client/employer, nor ought to be overwritten with desperately seeking, currently looking, actively looking, mainly because the sentiment is wrong. Although a lot of people use LinkedIn as a means of recruiting, the expectation isn't that you're desperately looking for work because you're on LinkedIn. The expectation is you're on LinkedIn because you want to engage and be visible to a whole bunch of people for a whole bunch of reasons. So you can be far more subtle on LinkedIn. You don't need to advertise your availability. What you need to advertise is your ability to deliver solutions that the marketplace may be looking for. The summary text that appears to explain what you're all about on LinkedIn ought to be similar in sentiment to the summary on your CV, as long as it's well written. What are you? What's your value proposition? What are you good at? Aligning it to skills being sought by the marketplace. Not a rambling monologue about how enthusiastic, bubbly and dynamic you are. Not critical, but of course you need to have them, but not super sensitive on LinkedIn. The positions that you have, so your experience, as it calls it, needs to be just a summary. There's no obligation to list everything if that works against you, if it allows people to do maths on your age or something like that. It could be a tailored list of things. It's up to you. But they just need to be a summary of what you've been up to, not a warts and all detail about what you've been up to. And then finally, the third critical area of LinkedIn, which a lot of people don't use actually, is called projects. And it's a place where you can put the evidence to support your ability to deliver. So really useful to get these case studies that we've been talking about into LinkedIn. And of course, you can have lots on the LinkedIn profile where you need to control it more on your CV. But you could have a whole portfolio of these things on LinkedIn which really demonstrate your wares and your abilities. Okay, I promised special offers, both for people actually thinking, I'll give this a go myself, and also people who might be thinking, I need help. For those that are thinking of doing it themselves, we actually do a little pack which consists of a template CV, a detailed writing guide, how to write your CV along the lines that I've been talking about this evening. For the next stage, a guide on how to deal with competency-based interviews, even access to a practice platform where you can practice interviewing as long as you've got a webcam in the privacy of your own home. When you've written your CV, you can bring it back to us and we'll take a look at it and critique it for you for free, and you get a voucher off our services going forwards if that might be of interest. Or for an amazing value, $19.99 plus VAT. And I have got my tongue firmly planted in my cheek. But that's a useful pack for those people thinking, yeah, I can do this myself. I'm not convinced by your argument that I need more help, but I do need some help, which is fair enough. You need to visit that URL, which I'm about to deposit into the toolbar facility you've got if you need to lift it, because you, other than see it, you can't do anything with it on the screen, unfortunately. but I've just zapped that into the chat room. For those thinking, oh, actually, I do need help, I don't have the time to do this myself, please help me. We will rewrite your CV from scratch and your LinkedIn profile from scratch, following the process that I talked about, the 2-hour consultation, getting the raw data out of you, and then rewriting everything that you need. You'll also get all the interview coaching guide stuff that the people buying the pack would benefit from, and indeed a voucher off any of our future services. And there are 2 options for one CV style. I've only shown you one CV style, but I'll explain briefly how this works very shortly. But if you decided, yeah, I need a CV writing, I like the case study style, that could really work wonders for me, I'm convinced, we will provide you with a CV and LinkedIn profile for $275 plus VAT. Ordinarily, that would cost $349 plus VAT, so it's quite a saving. For certain people, part of the discussion process when we start talking to people is that actually they may be thinking, I might need 2 styles of CV, the case study style that you've talked about, but also the more traditional chronological style, for good reason that we talk with people about. Alternatively, you might say, okay, I like this style of the case study CV that you've talked about, but I need more case studies. You know, I've got a lot of experience. I can wear more than one hat. How do I position my CV to different audiences? So what we do is we offer people the chance to build up a portfolio of case studies. So you get up to 8 as part of the standard deal. The 275 plus VAT option gives you 8 or up to 8 case studies. We can write 5 more, so you get 13 in total for $399 plus VAT, which gives you a lot of variety. So you can choose which case studies you present to your audience at any one time, because we give you more than enough to handle the audiences that you might be interested in. Or we could provide you with 2 CVs, one chronological style, one case study style. Now, as I say, later, very shortly, and when we do the Q&A session, I'm quite happy to show you the more traditional style CV if it's of interest. But I really just want to get across the message. We've got a lot of flexibility. If you need to position your CV to different audiences, the best way to do that is to vary the content, and we've got a way of managing that by way of these case studies. We just write more of them, allowing you to customize the CV according to your audience. Same URL. The only issue, apart from the fact that it costs money, is that it's also time limited. So the deal closes this coming Friday, midnight this coming Friday. Okay, that's it for the session. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that useful, and apologies it dragged on a little bit longer than I expected, but hopefully you got your value out of that. I promised to answer the questions. There have been a few. I don't know how many just yet, but I can see a few lurking there. So just bear with me about 30 seconds because I need to grab a drink of water, and then I will return. If you want to listen to the answers to the questions, you're more than welcome to hang on. If you need to disappear, then thank you for your time. Best of luck to you. If we can help, you know where we are, and good night. But for everybody else, if you want to hang on, give me 30 seconds, I'll grab a drink of water, and I'll come back and answer the questions.